What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Skald against the Black Priory, a retro RPG harkening back to the days of things like Ultima, but this one in particular is inspired by Lovecraftian horror as well, which it does very, very well. But before we dive into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a video linked below in the description that goes over everything I cover, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. Now, in the case of Skald specifically, it's important to mention that I did get a review copy for this, though we are a few days past the actual release of the game, as I wasn't quite able to hit the embargo time for a few different reasons, but still I did get a review copy of this one. And what's more, as 100%s go, it's pretty easy. Most of the achievements and the like are for things like simply clearing the story and the major side content, and I played for a fair bit longer than it took me to get all of the achievements. But with all of that said, let's talk a little bit about the game itself. Now, as I mentioned, a bit of a retro CRPG aimed specifically at recreating the feeling of older titles like Ultima, with, of course, that Lovecraftian spin on everything. But I think the real thing to mention in the case of Skald is that it very faithfully recreates Lovecraftian horror, or cosmic horror, the fear of the unknown and the unknowable. Because at pretty much every turn, this game nails an atmosphere that is centered around uneasiness and sinister undertones. So if you like Lovecraftian stuff, you'll probably enjoy this just on the face of it. But given its retro look, that is certainly not going to be for everyone, and its compelling character system, some choice and consequence, and I think we've got a fair bit to talk about overall. Starting first, of course, with the technical state of the game. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is that if you're having trouble with the visual clarity of this game, which I think is a fair complaint, there are a host of options in the menus to address at least some of that via things like the ability to change exactly what's going on with the fonts and the color of them to help you sort of see and read what is going on screen much easier, and there's a handful of graphical options that can disable things like weather effects that can add to the clutter on screen, making it difficult to check it out. And while, at least speaking for myself, it is definitely something you can get used to, it's definitely not going to land for everyone. Now, in terms of the game's actual performance, a few things to note here, but speaking purely for myself, I didn't really run into any bugs at all, either with specifically the review copy or the launch version, but I have seen some people report a few different problems. For starters, despite the way the game looks, the recommended specs for the game are a little higher than you might actually expect, and apparently this is due to some of the weather effects the game has, so turning those off might help you. And looking through Steam reviews, seeing how the game is running for other people, a few people have noted what would technically be game-breaking bugs here and there, such as story-related characters not showing up when they are necessary. But the good news here is that Skald actually comes with a console command. And if you go over to Steam, the developer has been helpful enough to actually provide the exact console commands to get the next scene that would trigger for the game so you can carry on. In basically every instance I've seen of that happening, so there is a decent workaround that will prevent you from having to do something like start over or deal with it, etc. Otherwise, the game seems to be in a decently good shape, and even those reports of those things have been seemingly a bit rare. So from a technical standpoint, while the game certainly isn't perfect, it is in pretty good shape. Next up, I want to talk a little bit about the difficulty of the title. So when you go to fire up a game of Skald here, you'll be presented with a few different difficulty options in the form of presets. But the catch here is that these presets aren't your only options. Once the game actually gets started, if you go into the menu, you can actually enable or disable a custom difficulty that will let you adjust all of these things and a few more to tweak exactly the experience you would like. So difficulty isn't something that is static, you can change it. And in fact, the presets don't affect everything that you can tweak anyway. For instance, all of the preset difficulties leave things like ignoring encumbrance, that is to say item weights, or turning off the random encounters on the world map, pretty much untouched. Now, the preset difficulties will affect things like your attack rolls, your damage rolls, and those of the enemies. as well as how many times the game will try to make sure that you don't actually miss anything. But overall, I would say that Skald, as far as CRPGs go, is pretty accessible. A lot of the combat is, I would say, much more approachable than a lot of those games, as the systems, while crunchy enough for what they are, don't really require like absolute system mastery to beat the game even, and in fact, I would go so far as to say that a lot of the main story stuff is significantly easier than some of the side content. But if you're worried about diving into this due to things like the difficulty, you have tons of options there. They can be changed whenever, and I'm always a big fan of that. I think modular difficulties are the way to go, and allowing people to enjoy the game that they paid for is always a win in my book. From there, though, let's talk a little bit about character creation before jumping into what the story is all about. So we will be generating our own character in this game, which comes down to picking a class, a background, attributes, and feats. The biggest of these choices is likely your class, and we can choose from a total of 9 different options, each of them representing a sort of general archetype, I would say, with a couple of them being slightly more advanced options of the others. For instance, Arms Master is basically your straight-up fighter that can use pretty much any weapon and armor and does great with those things, but doesn't really do anything else. Then we have characters like the Ranger, who can also use a ton of different weapons and armor like the Arms Master, but also focuses potentially on things like ranged weaponry or a little bit of spell casting if you prefer. The Officer is a great support character that can buff up your other party members, making them more useful. One of my personal favorites was actually the Battle Magos, which is basically your standard battle mage character where you can mix some good spell casting with some good melee ability. But each of these classes comes with a main attribute that dictates a lot of what they do and their abilities, and it will also adjust how much HP and magic and things you'll gain as you level up. Which then brings us to the background. The background is just a nice buff to everything else you're doing. Now, the game tells you this influences starting conditions and narrative content, but for me at least, I played through the game with a few different classes and backgrounds, and I did not notice this having a substantial effect on the game, so I really wouldn't worry about it too much. But what the background will do for you is provide you a nice bonus to your attributes or skills, which can be things like simply extra carry capacity, better stealth, better survival, which are used in all sorts of skill checks in the game. But I think as long as you pick one that complements the class and archetype you're trying to play, I think you'll be fine. Which brings us to attributes and skills. So we've got primary stats and skills to assign, with our primary stats affecting a whole bunch of secondary stats and our skills. Now, this is actually pretty important as far as choices go, because the only way to increase these after character creation is largely through items and a side quest that can actually buff up your primary stats. Now, obviously, the main thing you want to focus on here is whatever your class's main attribute is, and then you can spend like 1 or 2 points in a couple of other things. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory, and increasing a few of them will, of course, increase their relevant skills as well. And then you can spend your skill points to, I would say, bring those up to a maximum, and that'll kind of get you your basic outline for your character. Now, when it comes to skills and primary stats, it's probably important to mention that the skill checks in the game are basically your stat or your skill plus whatever you roll on a 2d6 roll against whatever the difficulty check for that is. So if I had say 4 athletics and I need to beat a difficulty of 10 to, say, perform whatever the skill check is, then I take my base skill in that, the game rolls a 2d6, and whatever that is gets added to my base skill, and then that has to beat the difficulty check. So pretty standard skill system, which then brings us to feats. So feats are, of course, class dependent, and they're all about buffing up whatever it is that character is meant to be good at. Now, each little node on the feat screen here can in fact be pumped up with a whole bunch of attribute ranks, and every time your character levels up, you'll wind up getting 3 more of these to spend. And a lot of these have a sort of tiered system where the more ranks you put into them, the better they get, increasing all sorts of relevant skills and attributes as well. Now, this is potentially where you can buff up your skills and your primary stats a little bit, but usually not to a huge degree, as a lot of those benefits come in the later feats, which are locked by your level. Now, you do not have to max out a node before you can move on to the next one, so if I can put 6 ranks into a feat, I don't need to put all of them in before I move on, but you certainly can. What's more, though, is that given that the max level of this game is only 20, you're not going to max out all of your feats, so you will have to pick and choose here and decide what you want your character to specialize in if you want them to be truly good at it, as a shotgun approach isn't going to quite work here. Unless, of course, you're on like a super easy difficulty. Now, then we wrap up character creation with a nice look at our sprite. Now, I will offer one complaint about the feats here, especially in character creation, is that I do think they could do a better job, especially your first time through, of actually explaining certain things, such as the fact that spell aptitude is generally how much like mana you have to cast a spell, what the spells even are, and while it's not completely unmanageable, I think this particular screen could use a fair bit of, I would say, quality of life updates that go a ways to explain exactly what some of these terms mean for people, what the abilities they'll be receiving actually are, etc., to help them plan out a build before they actually start the game. Now, luckily, I don't think the overall combat system is so complicated that this is necessarily a huge deal, but I do think it would be helpful. Now then, to wrap up character creation, we have our appearance. Now, with this being a pretty pixelated game, appearance is really customizing your sprite and your portrait. And once you've got that started, the game kicks off properly, which is where I want to talk about the story setup and my thoughts on it. So first and foremost, I'm going to try to avoid spoilers here as much as possible because this game just came out recently, and I think the story is a pretty compelling reason to play it with its Lovecraftian themes. But right away, when it comes to talking about the story, I think it's important to remember that first and foremost, this is a game about cosmic horror and Lovecraft, basically. So, as a result of that, if you're aware of kind of how that genre tends to go, you'll likely get the gist and undertones of the story pretty well. But to speak a little more specifically, our character, no matter who we made, plays as a mercenary who is hired by a former employer of your family to track down his daughter, who just so happens to be your old childhood friend. She is clearly not a normal child from some flashbacks you can receive, and there's some sort of unsettling mystical air about her, but recently, to the start of the game, she has disappeared to an area called the Outer Isles, seemingly looking for something, but she has yet to return, and there's been word that the Isles are not in good shape. So her well-to-do father, banking on your own goodwill or simply his ability to pay you, sends you off to track the woman down, which is what brings us to a sort of archipelago known as the Outer Isles. And almost immediately upon arriving, it becomes very clear that things are not okay here, as our ship is ultimately attacked by some sort of kraken-like creature that causes a shipwreck and our own character to almost drown before being washed up on the beach, where we'll come into contact with other survivors of the shipwreck and a few other characters who form our party, and we can get on with the task of saving the day, as it were, or at least attempting to. So overall, broad strokes, I like the story a fair bit. I will say that, again, if you're familiar with the genre, it sticks pretty close to that, so maybe keep your expectations in line with what that genre tends to entail, and, maybe look up the common themes and endings of that type of game to see what you're in store for. But beyond that, the game does feature a little bit of choice and consequence. Not a ton, mind you, but certainly a little bit. For instance, there's a town you can come across, which is the main focus of the early game where you're trying to get to, and when you arrive there, there's a whole bunch of sort of bandit leaders milling about, and you can either fight them outright, or you can come up with a creative solution to kill all of them without fighting any of them. And there's multiple other moments where the game presents you with a few different options to make your way through a given situation, typically, of course, relying on your given character's skills and abilities, which I thought was nice as well. But more than any specific moment, the thing about the story I really want to convey is just how well the Lovecraftian part of it is done, because this game has such an unsettling vibe to everything about it. Just the seemingly occult monsters, the deep feeling of unease, the actual horror elements, the monstrosities you'll be coming across, the mysteries you can get to the bottom of. are all just really weird and interesting to engage with, even despite the fact that this game has the pixelated look to it. If anything, I think that helps maintain a lot of the air of mystery that the game tends to exude. But story-wise, I thought it was pretty good. Obviously, none of it's voice acted if that was ever a thought that crossed your head, but nonetheless, let's move on a little bit to progression systems. Now, progression is relatively simple. It basically comes down to levels or gear. As I mentioned, your max level is 20 every time your character levels up from either completing quests or objectives or simply winning in combat. You'll gain 3 feat points to spend, of course, on your class's feats, ranking them up, making your character more effective by default, which can include things like learning new spells if you're a magic class, unlocking combat abilities, or simply increases to your skills in some cases. It's not an especially complicated system, though to be fair, I think that ultimately works in the game's favor, as there's enough going on that I don't think you need to necessarily be worried about micromanaging all these different little feats that you can stack up, but there's enough there to keep it compelling. But just like character creation, the feat screen I think could use just a bit more visual clarity or the ability to preview or understand a lot of what these options or terms mean, like, say the ability to click on them and it brings something up, which in my experience was a little bit inconsistent, because when you're out in like the world or combat, you can right click stuff and it will bring up like a description of what it is. If it's an enemy, its health, stats, etc. But still. Now the other part of progression simply being gear. As you move through the game, you're going to be obtaining all sorts of gear, which comes in different varieties of armor, different types of it, like light, medium, or heavy, which any individual class might specialize in. All sorts of weaponry, such as axes, maces, swords, ranged weapons, the usual stuff. You can also pick up a variety of crafting things that will allow you to craft either food or potions much easier, and the items themselves can often apply buffs to your attributes or skills. So as you're moving through the game, don't forget to keep an eye on your gear, as it does, of course, form a pretty core piece of character progression. But again here, it doesn't ever get overwhelming in terms of the amount of items or anything available to you, which keeps the game relatively approachable, as again, min-maxing just isn't really necessary on normal especially. But that brings us to the gameplay and world section of the title, which encompasses a few different things. So for starters, just from like a functional standpoint, the game focuses on a world map and then location-based exploration. So in an individual area, such as a town, you'll be free to run around that town, explore all the buildings, interact with it, and perform any skill checks or talk with anybody you might happen to run into. But once you move to the edges of that particular area, you can exit onto the world map. The world map can be mostly freely explored, but you can find all sorts of locations, which can lead you to interesting side content, side quests, etc. And it's probably important to mention that the game isn't massive here or anything, so don't expect to just endlessly run into content, but you can absolutely find a bunch of optional stuff. Some highlights being, say, a whole host of shrines, 5 in particular, that if you learn the appropriate rituals to perform at those shrines, can increase your main stats for every single one of your party members, which I thought was neat. But you do have to watch out, because while you're running around the world map, it is possible to run into random encounters if you haven't turned them off. And this can be positive, sort of beneficial stuff, like running into a vendor or useful materials. It can, of course, also simply be a fight, and you'll usually have a chance of a few different skill check rolls to get out of these, which is probably a good time to talk about skill checks. So whichever party member you have selected is going to be the default character for the skill check you encounter. However, during the sort of confirmation step of an individual skill check where it shows you the roll you're about to make, you can actually click on the portraits of your characters, which will then select who you actually want to make the skill check. So your party is capable of rolling for all of these for you, even if that's not the character you're actually using. Now, you can actually swap into the character you're running around with on the map, so I think that was kind of cool as well. Now, while you're going to start out on one individual island in the game, you can, a fair ways into it, actually get access to a ship and sail around the sort of archipelago area that is available, just as a little aside and something to look forward to for you. Now, in the process of doing all that, you might be looking for a map, and unless I just missed it, there isn't one. At least in most cases, you can't actually get a map for a sewer area. But I think the game is easy enough to get through without really having to micromanage exactly where you're at in any given area. So I didn't really have any trouble moving around or not getting lost without one, but just as a simple quality of life feature, I think it would be nice. And then there's a handful of other mechanics to be aware of. So in the process of all that exploration, you're likely to get hurt at some point, and this is where rest comes in. There is a rest mechanic in the game, and your party members can perform a variety of tasks while they're resting. Depending on your difficulty options, they will also need food here in order to actually rest in a sort of camp supply system. And while this can be done out in the wild, it is also possible while exploring to run into places with things like beds, etc., which are a much safer place to rest. So something to keep in mind there as well. And then another thing to understand is that there is an awareness mechanic behind a lot of your characters, that is to say, your ability to spot hidden things. And this is important because whereas the active skill checks, you can select someone to perform them, the awareness checks are being made by whoever you're actively running around the map with, which is going to affect your ability to find little secret loot stashes, or later on, potentially even some more important things that you need your character to notice. Now, beyond just a lot of that mechanical stuff, I think the world of Skald is also really interesting. There is, of course, lore and world building at play here, and a lot of it I found pretty interesting. For instance, there is apparently a big empire that controls most of the world through the power of their magi, who study what they call the reticulum in order to align themselves with it, which is what gives them the ability to cast proper magics, with the strongest of them being crowned the Emperor, who is apparently a person that is barely even human. They have command of such intense magic. And understanding how that empire works, but also other factions, such as, say, the Nautical Guild, which is how you got to the islands in the first place, the sailing involved, the mercenary companies, how towns operate via sort of guild lodges, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of cool stuff to learn about, but probably the best part is, again, just the Lovecraftian horror of it all. Even seemingly innocuous quests can turn into something dark and dreary with a bit of a twist that I think, despite the game's graphics, still manages to be a really gripping narrative, with some really interesting side quests that I think are likely at least a little bit inspired directly by proper Lovecraftian works. Like there was one quest I'm pretty sure was meant to be kind of in line with the King in Yellow. There's a direct reference to Deep Ones and a sort of Shadow over Innsmouth vibe. So if you like and enjoy any of that pretty much, I think there are quite a few things to explore and run into that might just be up your alley. But to end this section, I want to talk a little bit about the companions. So there are a handful of set companions throughout the game, or you can run into characters that you can hire as mercenaries to fill out your party. But you should run into pretty much all of the companions just as part of the actual story events. And the thing I want to mention here is while those companions are integrated into the main story well enough, they'll pipe up and have things to say about it, and they certainly have a personality, I do think it would have been interesting to see them have their own personal quest, like something they need to get done on the Isles, because a lot of them are kind of just along for the ride very generally, which is a shame because I think a lot of them are interesting and could have just stood to be fleshed out more, such as, I think it's Drina, the cleric companion, who is apparently a member of what they call the Sepulchites, which are people who seem to worship the emperors in some way, and I found their whole faith and culture very interesting, and I would have just liked to have seen more of it. So there are companions. I do wish they were fleshed out a little more, with the exception of like one or two that you get super early in the game, which is Roland or Cat. But all of that finally brings us to the combat section of the game, though probably a good time to also mention that a lot of combat can be avoided. I would definitely not say all of it, but things like stealth or simply looking for an alternative route can absolutely get you around certain encounters. So you don't necessarily need to tackle every challenge head on, just as a general bit of advice. But when it comes to combat, probably most importantly is that this is a turn-based tactical system. Those turns themselves are based off of initiative rolls and will encompass both the enemy and yourself, and this is going to utilize movement points, action points. But first, once combat gets started, you'll be in the midst of a sort of prep phase where you can manually move around your characters within a certain area to position them ideally for the upcoming battle. Now when it's your turn, you'll be given a host of movement points, which is largely down to what you have equipped. For instance, heavier armor will cut into this, but you'll be able to move so far and then take an action. This is a sort of standard, I would say, tabletop RPG kind of system, to be honest, where you get that one action, but later on through certain feats, you can, say, potentially attack twice via multi-attack for, say, an arms master. Later on, a couple of the mage characters can even cast more than once per turn, which can have some devastating effects on the battlefield. So a lot of what any individual character can do is basically down to their class and their feat choices. And broadly speaking, I would say combat is pretty fun once it gets going. Now, in the early game, it's pretty much just close distance and attack, or simply use a bow or something. But once you start racking up levels and unlocking certain feats, like the ability to perform certain combat maneuvers, more spells for your mage characters, etc., it can get pretty fun. Now, I would say the easiest way to play this game is largely just rolling an arms master and bashing everything in the face with a multi-attack weapon that deals a lot of damage. And on normal mode, honestly, that is more than enough as long as you can keep your character alive. Personally, though, I would say probably my most fun run was with a battle magos who technically is supposed to lean into fire, but I found the air school of magic very useful as well, as it comes with things like magic missile and haste spells and things like that that can buff up your party, but magic missile in particular is as useful as it is in the regular TTRPGs, where you can power it up to deal a ton of damage and you can actually cast it more than once per turn, and it was a very reliable damage dealer for a caster. But you can also get a whole host of other spells that do all sorts of things, like summon in creatures to help you, or cast larger AoEs once you actually get the ability to cast them, or simple healing magic. I would say the trick to both dealing with things like combat maneuvers and the magic system is simply playing around with the game and learning what does what, basically, as again, there is a little bit of quality of life issues with things like the game actually explaining what a lot of these terms are, what you need to click on in combat to even do a lot of this stuff, as the action bar isn't exactly intuitive either, with it mostly just using icons that you kind of just have to experiment around with and find something you enjoy. And once you get past that sort of experimentation phase and you understand what all of the individual components of this do, I think combat can be pretty fun, especially because some of the bosses that this game throws at you are especially compelling and interesting to mess around with and attack, because something about fighting occult horrors from the deep just never quite gets old for me personally, at least. In particular though, I think if you like older CRPGs, especially turn-based ones, this will likely be something you enjoy, and even if that's not your usual jam, it is tame enough to be relatively accessible for just about everybody. But broadly speaking, I think combat does a good job of highlighting what each character can do and giving you the ability to lean into that to maximum effect. And in particular, just one example is like, for instance, making a thief able to hide in combat, that is to say activate stealth, at which point they can sneak up on enemies, and activate backstab attacks, which if you lean into the feats for, can be an especially devastating way to deal damage. And there's a lot of cool stuff like that for each class that can make playing them feel a bit unique, which is where I think the combat system is doing its best. But that is juxtaposed a bit against the actual visual clarity of the system. A few times during the game I was actually just losing track of which characters were even mine on this battlefield because of the way the game looks, which is a bit unfortunate, of course. That though brings me to the Steam Deck section of this game, and I'm happy to report that this game, probably unsurprisingly, runs well on the Steam Deck. But there are certainly a few things to know. One, when you fire it up on that device, it may be a little awkward screen-wise, like the game showing up super small or something. If you go in and simply change the resolution of the game, it should sort that out for you. But not in the game itself, that is to say, going to the settings on the Steam Deck, specifically the properties for that game in your library, and adjusting it from the General tab should sort it out. And activating the game's CRT filter seems to work really well on the Steam Deck for whatever reason, which can help you out with things like simple visual clarity on that smaller screen. Now, the other part of that is that the game, being a small indie title, does not actually have native controller support, so you're likely going to have to use either a community layout or adjust some of the keys for yourself and find something you like. But basically, if you are willing to adjust and play around with those settings, you can absolutely play this on the Steam Deck, as obviously, from looking at the game, it's the kind of thing that fits in really well with older handheld titles in that regard, and the Steam Deck is more than powerful enough to handle it, but you will likely have to adjust a few things to get it where it needs to be enjoyable, let's say. But that brings us to positives, negatives, and then we will wrap this thing up. So on the positive side of things, we have the incredible atmosphere of this game, the nuance with which it tackles things like Lovecraftian horror, the choice and consequence, the relatively crunchy art RPG system for what is effectively a standalone unique system, even if it is heavily based on, I would say, more traditional TTRPGs, and even some of the game's choices I found kind of compelling to mess around with and see the different outcomes for. And having the game react to all of the things you're doing or the characters you've built feels really satisfying, especially because we don't exactly get a lot of Lovecraftian CRPGs out there, and I found a lot of that really enjoyable. Now, on the negative side of things, mostly what I've got for you guys is a handful of minor gripes. I think things like the feat screen could be cleaned up to simply be more clear about what a lot of the individual terms mean, so you don't necessarily have to trial and error your way through it. I think the visual clarity in combat specifically could be cleaned up a bit, especially once you get a whole bunch of characters, a full party of 6, and just little quality of life changes, for instance allowing me to set a custom difficulty directly from character creation rather than having to wait to start the game to then go in and mess around with custom difficulty settings as opposed to a preset. So there's a lot of just little tiny stuff like that I think the game could improve on. And then a slightly more major issue for me at least is I do wish the companions were a little more fleshed out and had more content associated with them. Because as dark and dreary as the rest of this game is, and some of the things I've said about the genre of cosmic horror as a broader topic, I think it would be really compelling to get to know these characters before the genre does what the genre does. But truth be told, I also think those are relatively small issues, which brings me to my conclusion. So for everything I've just went over, for as long as this review is, Skald is, believe it or not, only $15 US at full price. So for that very honestly cheap price, you're getting a really crunchy RPG that has a fair bit of choice and consequence, a compelling RPG system that allows you to make a few different characters to run through the game with, this Lovecraftian thing that you rarely see done well, and I think you've got yourself a very compelling case to check out this game. Because basically it comes down to, does the art style bother you? Is this something you can play without getting too lost in the weeds of what you see on screen? As this admittedly simply just visually is not for everybody. But if that particular thing doesn't put you off, then I think there is a fantastic game underneath with a few minor issues to be sure. But for $15, I think it's a tremendous experience that you should absolutely check out, especially since it's on a small launch discount from now through the 6th, so you can actually pick it up for a tiny bit less. But either way, this game absolutely gets a buy out of me. I enjoyed it a great deal, but that's where we're going to wrap it up. So do let me know down below what you think about this title, especially if you've already played a little bit of it for yourself. I'd love to know what you think, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.